Hello everyone, today we talk about Francesco Guicciardini and the Italian Wars. Just like figures such as Dante, Guicciardini suffers of being mostly remembered as a literary figure because of his historiographical work on the Italian Wars, that instead played also a great deal of political and military roles in the same period. Besides, Guicciardini lives a bit in the shadow of Machiavelli, that objectively was a greater figure, if anything, from a literary, theoretical, broader cultural point of view. Many people ignore at least the general context in which we are entering now, considering that I decided, I don't know if you noticed this, to increase Renaissance history content. This will also increase over time further, as I think we must really cement the connections between the present and also our more discussed medieval and ancient times. I've always been making lots of videos about the Renaissance and early modern, especially warfare, but looking at the politics of it in some depth and through these characters that are more or less known even to common people, so to say, I think can be a very interesting fourth example, the consequences we will measure along the way. However, this video is truly on the same Guicciardini, because we haven't talked, I think we made only one video about the Italian Wars. That was just a story up to, by the way, 1525, the Battle of Pavia, the capture of Francis I. So Guicciardini dies in 1540, and he lives on for a lustrum and more that basically changed a big deal in the political and strategical settlement of Italy, of Europe, in the process. All right. Guicciardini is also, we will learn more about him. If anything, it's the first time we talk about him too, so a minimal introduction will be given. Contextualizing him as a thinker within this period. All right, we will see how he was a governor who was in charge also of military situations during the Italian Wars, that everybody sort of discusses maybe for the major battles, etc., but does not maybe digress on in terms of political analysis. Today we will essentially discuss a theme that was very dear to Guicciardini and that revolved around the vexata question, also the pretty big question, in fact, of how such a civilized country like Italy in the 16th century was overrun, right, losing great part of its political autonomy with not independence, regardless of the important chunk of states that remained fully independent from a formal institutional point of view, and that we also made other videos on for that matter, without mentioning the continuity with the Holy Roman Empire. And so here, what kind of alignments are we actually looking at? Because there are different players, including, in fact, the Habsburgs, both from Germany and from Spain. There is France. There is these are the players that will ultimately toy with the Italian states. Naturally, there is on the background of all this the Turkish threat and many other aspects that, of course, deeply impacted the not just Italian politics, but also the way the Italian states dealt with them from a strategical point of view, from a cultural point of view as well. This is the moment in which, paradoxically, Italy is conquered, and yet it conquers Europe yet again by making essentially Italian in every field the language of modern Europe, and maintaining actually a pretty prestigious and affluent position in the process as well, right? The Italian states remain these secondary players that, however, as far as especially the Mediterranean theater is concerned, are actually pretty important and pretty powerful. You can argue that even after the Italian Wars, Italy as a whole was a superpower for many reasons, not just the shocking level of technological advancements, of wealth, the highest per capita in the world until the end of the 17th century, surpassed, by the way, at that point by the English and the Dutch, so not by other peoples in the process, and that late, and being actually a veritable military power. Venice alone, navally wise, would remain such a power until essentially the siege of Candia. I recently made a video about the First Morean War, just after that, but at that point, say in a broader international picture, you can't really claim that Italy was redimensioned. There is actually the forgotten giant of southern Italy, essentially the Neapolitan kingdom, that was, however, a vice realm in the hands of the Aragonese, right? And essentially more or less the unified crown of the whole Spain at that point. That was immense, right? Naples was still in the 18th century the largest city in Europe, and that actually had a very strong manpower. And the general historiographical vicissitudes of why these states are not discussed are very complex. They stem from different dynamics. From one side, you have essentially this, we often discuss it, we've also done it yesterday in the video about the history of medievalistics. The prevalent Anglo-American culture derives in turn from the Protestant one of the 16th, 17th century in terms of historiographical framing. And fundamentally, the attention towards any historical events, it shifts towards Northwestern Europe, even in times when it was not necessarily more advanced, and with a pinch sort of contempt and denigration towards anything that was Catholic, papal, whatever. Also in broader racial terms, during the 19th century, these things basically took off from a mass sort of society perspective up to the 18th century. Italian immigrants in the world were rich, educated, essentially aristocratic people from the 19th century. The Italian unification, especially the hardships that this caused for the southern Italian economy, of course, brought these people that were among the in fact in the south, the least developed in Europe, that however sort of were stamped on the Italian flag, regardless of the northwestern Italy. It was one of the most industrialized parts in Europe, even before the Italian unification. On the other side, you have the same Italians that in their unification essentially had a very strong anti-Habsburgic bias, right? In the age of nationalism, of course, the Holy Roman Empire was no more from Napoleonic times, that had injected, as we know, a bit also those national statal ideas. And basically everything that the same Italians began to study in the 19th century, or also medievalistics, was developing in a more serious sense. Also, Renaissance historiography was being studied more carefully, basically eliminated properly at a point, I think properly in the Italian armed forces academies, the interest by law, the funding for any research that had to do with pre-unitary powers, because except for essentially Savoy that had unified Italy and Venice that had more or less remained on her own. And so anything that was Holy Roman Imperial, and actually the very old and even glorious tradition of Italian arms commanders in the Holy Roman Empire during the 30 Years' War, during all the clashes of the 16th, the 17th century and beyond, were basically forbidden, taken away. And so any kind of attempt to start with the right foot from a sort of military historical point of view was somehow rigged. Right, and so when, again, naturally Italy maintains a very strong, and also because of the events of the Italians Wars, a very strong classicistic approach, whereby other people came to know, and so, as you understand, this is historiographically valid, as naturally Italy managed through the unification to be, again, one Western power, say the last of the big, or the first of the little, as it was also said, but in the sense not to become central, of course, in also in the following generations, that witness also the loss of the centrality of Europe compared, say, to the United States, the first half of the 20th century, and that therefore do not make it even to spread its sort of historical culture towards for example, topics like the military one, and that aren't fundamentally literary, aren't classicistic, that, of course, do not pertain to that high academic culture that characterizes still today the peninsula, and that yet has some kind, in fact, more classicistic, philologistic, humanistic, and not for the worse, right? Literally talking peaks here, but still, like, not being, for example, very versed in military historical studies. Of course, in the recent decades, the Italians have gapped a great deal of this void, and they have started producing probably more even than other Western countries about their own military history. But a lot has yet to be done, and very often, and this is really a broader character of our era, right, in the West during this time in history, in these generations, there is really no cohesive approach academically wise anymore. Everything is hyper-specialized. We lack some sort of broader vision, and unfortunately, any military history that could have and was imperfectly developed around the world, because there is not really a country in the world that really gets it or ever gotten it. Just think that, after all, the saying von Clausewitz wasn't, hasn't become central as a foundational necessity in terms of historical teaching, if anything, from a methodological point of view, but in a deeper philosophical, moral, and scientific one. Well, you can understand how poorly we have pictured history at every level, right, from the academia to places, so to say, like YouTube and the general pop culture. Hence, you find this horrifying void that we have documented, by the way, for medieval Italian warfare as well, right? Literally, they had the most advanced armies of the era, nobody cared. And this is still something that nobody's pointing out for some reason. It tells you how blipped up, generally speaking, scholarship can be in a broader international and transversal sense. But as for Dante, that I made a series on the anniversary of his 700th death anniversary, classicism has somehow portrayed figures like, again, Dante. To an extent, it depends here. I want to make the military reference, but even Petrarch, who was definitely not a soldier, but I don't know, Machiavelli, or the same with Guicciardini, as some sort of figures, and others, naturally, mostly inclined towards some purely literary inclination, and in this sense mirroring that kind of Black Legion, kind of eternally decadent kind of Italian culture, and or as sort of becoming memes for any particular aspect other than their deep political and in some cases also pretty important military involvement. And so all the broader picture that laid in their general background and context. And I personally don't know, for example, on YouTube, any innovative topic of this kind. Now, talking Guicciardini has also to do with his personality. He was a fairly withdrawn, sensitive, even mystical, melancholic man. You understand the gist of that? He had, as we'll see now, important qualities. He was able to create his own path as much as, being able to follow others. And historiographically speaking, he passed down to history as a man of letters, mostly with the charge of some sort of cynical self-interest that would have essentially characterized the period in Renaissance Italy as essentially some attempted explanation from the individual to the collective of how and why Italy collapsed at that point, at least as a de facto independent country, and or at least maintaining its pernicious fragmentation that Italians had tried partially to counter in the previous generations due to the metus hostilis, due to the an increased self-awareness and more. Again, Italy has a national culture way before a unified state ever came about, right, encompassing the whole peninsula. and this is also something that people have severe problems to understand. You have seen it also with, Ukraine, or with other states that, according to that logic, like up to the 19th century, 20th century, should have never existed, right? As states on their own are separated from the others. And what's the point of Austria? Yeah. Or Slovakia, right? Those are questions that, in general, people like to take shortcuts by saying, well, no, it shouldn't exist according to the political inclination, right? And sort of third-grader explanations. But of course, we are not even going to make the case for such a renowned civilization like the Italian Renaissance one. We will see now that things were much more complex and complicated than they seem, because as it often happens whenever a big cycle comes to an end, such as, the same Middle Ages for Italian history itself, that alone would have provided with a sense of fracture, and with Italian wars that were objectively a very important fracture for Europe as a whole, the message passes as if, those Italian states that we often discuss for medieval history had at some point disappeared, had in fact not remained important, or had not even under the sphere of influence or this or that foreign power, hadn't actually been de facto still sovereign countries within on their own in some cases. Think about Venice, and or even when imperial subjects still maintaining, for example, within the Italic kingdom, an autonomy on their own, siding with different powers, different times. The papal states themselves being very much in line with the Habsburgs, especially very close to the Spanish. Also hosting these being naturally controlled. Think about all the various also influences that could come through a foreign pope of sort, but still de facto remaining industrial countries, right, of a pretty traditional framework that especially in these countries is very much felt, as we were explaining yesterday, talking about the history of mediavistics, and that in fact you should not shift the focus from as if, again, the modern age began and all you have to study is, again, the aforementioned England or the Netherlands, and without caring so much about France or Spain in comparison to them, right? We're not talking about all Central, Eastern Europe, the same Ottoman Empire to some degree, but again, if you look at Italian powers, even from a military point of view at the time, were really a might to be reckoned with, especially at sea. The naval capacities of the Italians were crucial, like the fleets of Lepanto were not Spanish. They were intertwined with the Spanish. They were commanded by a multinational admiralty, but as it had been for most of the Middle Ages, if not all of them, they were mostly made up by Italian ships, crews, and in fact admirals themselves. Nevertheless, we will talk about this stuff, but just for saying again that, yes, there's a huge crisis that Italy undergoes, and people sometimes try to counterbalance judgment and say, oh, well, so it wasn't such a big deal, it was a huge deal. But still, the resources of this country are a huge deal and by themselves. And so you must be able to picture history through this level of scale and and broader political analysis. Otherwise, you can't properly objectivize the reality for what it is. Let's talk, before passing to Francesco Guicciardini, to another figure that is directly tied with him in history, if anything, for his drama, Filippo Strozzi. Filippo Strozzi's life, in their particulars, evoke sympathy for his tragic demise and underscored his political significance, precluding, for example, the idea that he should be regarded as a defender of the Florentine liberty, equated with the one of other figures like Ferruccio and other martyrs of the valiant resistance of Florence to the imperial siege, right, of 1530. That is also one of the most famous events in this period of the Italian wars. All right. Filippo was born in 1489 to a prominent banking family, the Strozzi, right, that had, as you know, been competing historically with the Medici. Filippo had married Clarice Medici in 1508. Clarice was a name that also derived, as you know, from the Orsini. And he only allied with the anti-Medici populists in 1530 during the same siege of Florence by the imperial forces for essentially instrumental reasons rather than any particular sympathy towards the populists, right, that he had actually resisted throughout his life. And only in his final moment siding with them, right? This is important to stress because it shows you how in the Florence of Guicciardini, the broader settlement of the what would be essentially the Grand Duchy of Tuscany was not properly entirely defined, not just internationally, but also regarding the internal leadership, right? But this doesn't mean that Florence wasn't, for example, capable of withstanding an imperial siege or maintaining an important display of unity. Filippo was more a competitor than an adversary of the Medici, and if anything, his shift during the siege reflects the complex interplay of personal ambition and political necessity that characterized Florence's elite, that, as you know, had maintained a sort of republican bias. Was to remain actually in Tuscan history up to pretty late in time. Think about the enlightened Habsburgic reforms of the 18th century. Florence was, I think, the first country in the world to abolish that penalty. It was very sort of liberal and progressive, and stemming from this almost Commonwealth profile that Florence had, as we discussed in this recent series made on Florence. We're making really a lot of videos about Florentine history, but at this point, it's all random. Just this ties very well, again, with yesterday's browsing of Italian Renaissance scholarship. Well, imagine these are the same places we were talking about yesterday, and therefore, regardless of the undoubted prestige by this point that the Medici had historically acquired, it was still possible to pick another house within Florence, and sort of also through the push of the population to overthrow this or that sovereign in the moment, right? Strozzi, to make the long story short, we will see his story better before it was taken out because of this, right? And it tells you how brutal, after all, Florentine political life still was at this point, and how unsettled, again, the whole picture really was. I also created recently a playlist about the House of Medici, and I think I'm just going to insert maybe this video as well in there, even though it's not really about the Medici per se, but about Guicciardini. In any case, it is really appropriate to examine this key figure in Florentine history, Francesco Guicciardini, who passed away on May the 22nd, as we were saying, in 1540, at the age of 57. Consider even just the anthropic dimension of these individuals, chronologically, the times, the places, the fact that people normally died pretty early on a regular basis at the time. After, in this case, suffering partial paralysis for 18 months as well, so a pretty painful and pitiful passing. Born in 1483 to a wealthy family with Medici ties, he studied law in Florence, Ferrara, and Padua. These were among the most important centers, as you know, in the Italian Renaissance. I mean, Florence in the 15th century was probably the capital of Renaissance. Things would shift towards Rome in the 16th, but Ferrara was the city, the capital, de facto, of the Este. Family was of such important political and strategical relevance in the balance of Italian powers and foreign ones. Padua, essentially the center of northeastern, and at this point, essentially Venetian humanism. So, as we were explaining before, given the background of Italian humanists, these people were individuals, again, essentially of aristocratic, with not nobiliar background, of enormous wealth and culture just by extraction, and educated in literally the top universities in Europe. Now, among, in fact, the oldest ones. We also discussed this a bit in our videos about medieval universities. Guicciardini had married Maria Salviati. The Salviati were yet another very rich and influent family, to say the least. This happened in 1508, and since 1537, Cosimo de' Medici, the ruler of Florence, had marginalized Guicciardini as essentially governmental advisor, though he continued to hold prestigious positions among other powerful Florentine figures of the Medicean establishment. In truth, the new Duke of Tuscany, Cosimo, was shedding the limitations Guicciardini had sought to place on absolute rule, a maneuver that reflected Cosimo's desire to consolidate power by distancing advisors who favored constitutional checks. You know that Tuscany had stepped up in its Florentine government by the attribution of the ducal title. Would essentially be the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. And this posited it in a more firm, sort of hierarchical, feudal relation. At this point, as you understand, the same emperor was actually besieging Florence for the political reasons that today we will not digress on. But it had changed as a system since the times of, say, Lorenzo or Cosimo il Vecchio, that we discussed in recent videos, towards some ever more oligarchic but not monarchic direction, even though, again, as we were saying before, the Tuscan government institutions would always maintain a pattern of republican regime. They would follow a fairly decentralized, autonomous governmental system, unlike, again, other powers at the time, especially provided with, ranks of Grand Duchy, for example. This tells you also how relevant Tuscany was. You know that the Medici hadn't been a particularly militaristic power, but they were still standing on their feet while the forces had gone in this picture. And so, in general, things had really been changing in Italy also along the pattern. We will not talk about Machiavelli today, because it would be too much even for the routinely subtracted space from the figure of Guicciardini, even though, again, I like Machiavelli better. But, again, they're two different people. Machiavelli was very cold, straightforward, much of a sort of... He made his miscalculations, but he left us a civilizational legacy that is incredible to behold. And he was part of a very specific bureaucratic context that had forged him in with a certain vision, a certain take on politics and government as a whole. So also from a military point of view, that is really unique and very deep, like not just like bureaucratic mentality only, but something, as you know, with a larger scale. Guicciardini was, in a sense, more melancholic. Machiavelli was in the eye of the storm of the Italian wars, in the most intense period. You know that things were concentrated definitely in military activity also up to Pavia. That's why I made that chronological cut there, talking about the Italian wars. Whereas Guicciardini was observing the system as it had emerged from that. And so basically a more tamed Italian reality in relation to foreign powers, and a level, in fact, of liberty loss and subjection to such bigger forces that essentially the Italians hadn't been able to check, to prevent from swarming into the peninsula and to dictate rules. Also co-opting, by the way, powers like Cosimo's, for example, that had become more authoritarian, despotic, so to say. Hence, part of, especially for Florence, that had such a strong sort of liberal, in the sense of proper Republican liberty bias, left some sort of bitter aftertaste, especially in figures like Guicciardini, that thus you can start immediately to understand in that kind of in that kind of melancholic and pessimistic perspective, right? And in the moment, especially in which Guicciardini was kept aside from greater offices of power, as this Florentine establishment could also access, a man who had been among Italy's most prominent political figures for a quarter century faded into obscurity. Right, Guicciardini was in part removed from his cursus honorum, right, and put a bit aside. Hence, again, his intellectual production. In 1526-27, he poured his intellect and passion, free from the cynicism and self-interest often overstated in critiques of him, and that we will delve a bit more into now, into securing the success of the League of Cognac, formed, as you know, in 1526 by Pope Clement VII, France, Venice, and Florence, hence eventually the war with the imperials, to expel, in fact, the Spanish imperial forces, and freeing Italy from, in particular, Spanish and foreign domination generally, even though, again, all these powers had interest in gaining more power in the peninsula, also the same Italians at the expense of other Italian states, and or at least maintaining some kind of balance. Guicciardini was part of this machination. This was one of the three goals he most fervently pursued. So let's recapitulate. As we'll see now, Guicciardini will come to live in the papal and work for the papal states. He naturally has the means to sustain himself. As we've seen, these people were affluent, they had properties and all. They wouldn't remain without money, even without an employ. And however, he had finally time to write a lot, right? That is, as we will see now, mostly his politological legacy and take on the world, right? We should also point out, as we'll see better now, that Guicciardini was not really born a humanist, a scholar per se. He was mostly again, a politician, a businessman as well, so it's relevant to read his perspective on that as sort of a bit of a different background from Machiavelli's, and in fact separating him as a source from very important humanistic and in some ways purely scholarly ones, courtly ones, that we normally read from. So. And the latter, especially because of the particular Florentine origin, that was, as we've seen, somehow more liberal, right? But it's important to have a witness that to the events, to the tragic events of the Italian wars, that was not merely writing for someone, but at some point also expresses his own judgment from a perspective of direct involvement in specific political offices, also in broader economic issues that you want to take in consideration. Even if his view is sort of more personal, more subjective than Machiavelli's, that really had a much wider scope and broader purpose. Guicciardini's work is obviously mentioned in tandem with Machiavelli's for the Italian Renaissance, especially the period of the wars of Italy. Now, the Cognac League is definitely one of the most tragic turning points of the Italian wars as well. And if Guicciardini's vision of, especially an Italy free of the Spanish, was not realized then, the blame rests mostly not on Guicciardini, of course, nor on the all the other players here involved as a sort of projection of Guicciardini's sort of politicological take or anthropological take on them, right? In fact, also Guicciardini's diplomatic efforts during the preparation of the League of Cognac were undermined by the fragmented ambitions of the Italian states that could not attain independence de facto, once again, from foreign powers, right? This was essentially one of the most important problems of this all. These Italians truly believe, I mean, if you have read Machiavelli, you know that the Italians didn't really lack anything in terms of, for example, material power or, even military development to a degree, right? And this analysis was actually correct, right? It turns out that if you think, paradoxically, the Venetians or the Genoese deposing their Atavic rivalries, objectively, with their naval forces combined, nor France nor Spain would have ever been able to get a hold of the Italian peninsula the way they did, all right? Aragon was already in charge of the south, but even then, right, we're talking about an actual balance of power. It was that delicate, actually, and if a great effort had been made by the Italian states, it was absolutely a thing for Italy to remain something on its own, if anything. But it was exactly its particularisms, the fact that all these Italian states, and we'll surely make a better video on this topic, were, after all, considering themselves as states. This is what also people often do not understand, that even though they considered themselves Italians, they were, of course, in charge of their own respective states. And as such, given that some were very powerful, like, Venice, or even the Papal States, you see Tuscany remaining on its own, de facto Genoa remaining on its own, and more. The notion of, I will simply carve for myself sort of a niche in here to survive, while other powers are essentially clashing against one another and with great difficulties, right? It's not like, France or Spain were omnipowerful or in fact could simply take over the entirety of the Italian peninsula. Again, just a part of that was basically, crashingly in the broader possibility of for example, anti-literam Italian unification that, again, could not be made. It was properly unconceivable at the time for this particular mentality of the various powers within the peninsula. And so Guicciardini, as we explained, is the guy who looks at this and expresses the more, disheartened, impression of the outcome in particular, and reflects on all the lost hopes, right? There is a lot of dualism here in this all, right? Pope Julius II, for example, was mostly famous for having raised the war cry, the barbarians out of Italy, but he had himself come back to Italy from political exile for also internal political Italian reasons, together with Charles VIII's army of France in 1494. So we're talking, again, an incredibly complicated picture that, if you even appreciate Guicciardini's life in a video like this, you can scholarly understand in its complexity. So going back to Guicciardini, born in 1483 to a prosperous family with mercantile roots, as was typical for Florentine aristocracy that could marry into royalty across Europe, but was fundamentally of this mercantile tendency, if anything, and which had shifted to politics over several generations and maintained tied to the Medici. Francesco was the third son of Piero. Unlike his father, that was one of those typical Italian merchants with branches all across Europe. So again, it's that kind of heavy and high banking and international intertwinement that makes you understand how much Italy and Europe were tied together at every possible national level, especially again in the West. And again, there is a reason and why Italy is the target of all these powers, aside from broader, say, international alignments. And again, I'm sorry I can't talk about this today, but as you understand here, we're getting also a bit more in depth in certain particular aspects. Unlike his grandfather, Jacopo, who favored scholarly pursuits over politics and trade, the Guicciardini now was involved in the silk business in collaboration with the Segni family as well. Francesco pursued, as we've seen, legal studies in the top studia of the time. I made a video about the Mos Italicus that was essentially spreading Roman law all over Western Europe. And so if you're interested in this kind of juridical mentality that Guicciardini is an expression of, you can check that video out, plus the one on France, Spain, Germany, etc., because it's all tied into that. And with the same Italian words, you understand how, straightforward this is. Therefore, Francesco worked as a lawyer. But his true calling was politics after all, right? Or at least his life brought him there. Defying his father's wishes, he wed a Maria di Alessandro Salviati, as we've seen in 1508, from a family aligned with the Medici and opposed to the lifelong gonfaloniere Piero Soderini. It was Florence's chief magistrate from 1502 to 1512, crucial years, also for the Medici. Interestingly, that same year, the Strozzi married Claricia Medici. Despite this, in 1512, at the age of 29, Guicciardini was tasked with a diplomatic mission to Ferdinand the Catholic. Now, she was dead, but husband of Isabel of Castile, therefore father to Joanna La Loca, the wife of Philip the Fair. Therefore, these were the parents, as you know, of Charles V. And again, Maximilian, and also Charles' troops were involved in the Italian wars like hell, as you know. And so we're looking at a particularly interesting meeting. You understand already at this diplomatic level that naturally figures like Guicciardini were trusted for considering their highly cultured, also again legal in this case, background. This diplomatic mission to Ferdinand of Spain was intended to gain time. We should say Ferdinand of Aragon, because the entire point is that Joanna inherited Castile, right? And that was important, but that's also another story. Intended to gain time amid the struggle between the Pope and Spain on one side and France on the other. Though hesitant as accepting meant forsaking his legal career, Guicciardini set out in late January 1512 and returned only 2 years later, by which time the Medici had regained control of Florence, because this was the phase in which they had been overthrown. And Giovanni de' Medici had become, in the meanwhile, Pope Leo X, famously enough. Here, as you know, we're in the time of Luther, of the Reformation, and so on. There was still Maximilian ruling in the empire. The mission defined Guicciardini's path, revealing his true vocation, by the way. Residing in a court steeped in European intrigues under Ferdinand, a shrewd ruler capable of any deceit and unburdened by scruples. I mean, he was really a son of a blow. I mean, I love Isabel because she was really... She had massive... She had more balls than... Way more balls, gigantic balls, more than her husband. But again, he was pretty sharp too as well. So Guicciardini honed his political acumen further and fostered also further that degree of skepticism about the role of ideals in the dynamics of political power. Something that will recur rhetorically in his work. An experience at the court of Ferdinand that shaped his pragmatic approach to governance, prioritizing strategic calculation over ideological purity, right? Which is bitter enough, and it's typical of the Renaissance, you would argue. Naturally, as I always point out, never presume that, from whichever date onwards we can talk about different modern political thinking that was not the traditional medieval one anymore. Actually, as I was saying before as well, it would be more productive to, in order to properly give an objective assessment, to consider more the continuity of political morals and just practical government and general social cultural realities from the previous generations, right? Rather than just seeing a sudden fracture. Doesn't matter how big the Italian wars really were, we should not at least categorize these as simply modern history as opposed to some kind of, pre-modern history at this point. So Guicciardini returned to Florence at that point after the diplomatic mission. He swiftly secured high-ranking positions, and in 1516, Leo X appointed him governor of Modena and later Reggio, where he gained renown for his decisive eradication of bandits, a feat that showcased his administrative rigor. So at this point, he went over to the papacy, given the Medici connection, the Medici Pope, and he becomes a governor there. Right, so he is sent to Emilia, mostly to repress various bands of brigands that infested the countryside. If you read, for example, Ariosto's life, more or less the same places that were in Urbino also and nearby that were part of the Papal States. This was a plague that infested Italy and other countries in Europe for the pre-contemporary era, when naturally heavier coercive means existed to pacify the territory. And here he did well, by the way. When a war erupted in 1521 as Commissary General of the Papal forces, Guicciardini protected Parma from French assault. Right, so he witnessed a war, he controlled the situation, he was in charge of the defense of the cities at the time. Consequently, Clement VII named him president of Romagna in 1524. This is very important because Romagna constituted essentially also a very strategic place, as you know, where battles like the one of Ravenna were fought. The passage for central and southern Italy mostly happened on the Adriatic side from there, and you could from there also descend through the Apennine toward the Seine, Rome. And Guicciardini ruled the turbulent area with a firm hand, which is extraordinary because, again, if we consider him just like the withdrawn, melancholic guy, we think, oh, what did he do when he was in charge of something? He actually was good at it. He was a key figure, as we've seen, in the forming of the League of Cognac, after he had been distanced from this governmental affairs. And during 1526-27, he collaborated tirelessly with the same Machiavelli to preserve Milan and stop the imperial Landsknechten. These were at the time of essentially the sack of Rome as well, and so you can imagine the disappointment at the outcome. As much as it was for everybody involved, including Charles V, that was notified of the sack by the Landsknechten were mostly Lutherans, even though they were imperial soldiers, but they weren't so effort as the Spaniards, as a matter of fact, the Catholic Spaniards in the sack of Rome. Hence, that the news arrived on, or actually, I don't remember the exact date, but on essentially the birth of his son and heir, Philip. And regardless of the enormous festivities that normally follow these events, Charles issued to wear black because out of respect of the tragedy that had happened in Rome, and that definitely was a stain on his reputation, given that he was, in any case, the guy in charge. We'll talk about that too. So Guicciardini was in the eye of the storm there because, speaking of the League of Cognac, the reluctance of allies, the Pope's indecision, and the death of Giovanni delle Bandanere, this famous mercenary leader that eventually, also fathered what would have become the following Grand Duke of Tuscany as a Medici himself, in 1526 thwarted the Saint Guicciardini's efforts, prompting him to lament that it seemed God intended Italy's downfall. Giovanni delle Bandanere is one of Giovanni de' Medici. The black bands were a reference to yet another funerary homage And he's often, at least the Italian unification, the Risorgimento rhetoric made him perhaps a bigger figure than he was. Indeed, he was the only guy who was doing something about the imperial army essentially crossing northern Italy towards Rome. And he died, as you know, because of the infection followed to the amputation of his leg that was hit by a falconet shot. And so these guys had participated also to the French military fort at some point before Pavia. They hadn't been paid, so they went away, and they eventually found themselves in this other situation. So it's a bit difficult. It's not like Giovanni had any chance to prove himself at higher strategic levels. So indeed, he died a hero, but his overall relevance in the picture may have been overstated. Nevertheless, at that point, Guicciardini was quite grieved, and understandably so, bringing about this further pessimism in the governor's mind. Still, Guicciardini succeeded, at least in shielding Florence from plunder on the same occasion, and did all he could to urge the Allied army's commander to save Rome, as the Landsknechten were marching towards the Urbs, a force that demonstrated his commitment to preserving Florentine stability amidst broader Italian chaos, and obviously the same papacy that was allied with the Tuscans. Meanwhile, Florence ousted the Medici in 1527, and with the Pope declaring neutrality after the exhausting sack of Rome, Guicciardini retreated to his villa to contemplate or write. So he had been disappointed by the duchy. He had been now essentially in a general situation of lack of references, also in the broader future. And again, he had failed in the bigger picture of the League of Cognac had failed. So this is not where, as we were saying before, Cosimo had become ruler of Florence and had ousted also different political opponents, etc. As this power had been reinstalled properly and recognized in the feudal picture as the Medici would be reinstalled. This was probably the moment in which the greatest blow was affecting Guicciardini and great part, in fact, of the Medici effort that, as we've seen, had brought even to their ousting from Florence. Imagine again the situation where you are involved at such high level, and then you pass to basically live in private life temporarily, and or at least looking at the unfolding of these dramatic events. This all while, for example, the French and the Turks, who were allied and passing, with Rome wasn't sacked by the Ottomans, right? By Hayreddin Barbarossa. We don't know why. We're passing by. The Genoese fleet was actually on their tail, but there was also plague breaking out after the sack. It was a complete disaster. There's the Battle of Capua. Again, all a very interesting military history, but at the time, like a total disaster for everybody involved. So many people dying. All these famous leaders at some point also losing their lives. Besides the downfall of the Gonfaloniere Capone, that was Guicciardini's friend and kin in April 1529, and the rise, as well as the rise of radical Democrats, so the usual populists that rise in this moment of popular delirium at the weakening of the authority, compelled Guicciardini to leave Florence for Bologna. That's when he rejoined the Pope once again, so straddling these two central Italian states. At least this was in northern Italy, in the northern part of the Papal States. Summoned to appear and declared a rebel by the way, because, again, the Florentine radicals now were chasing the exiles, and in fact confiscating their possessions if they didn't show up to be sentenced. In fact, Guicciardini owns possessions were seized. This yet other blow and trauma, right? Naturally, in Florentine history, we know how common this was, even if it is far away. 200 years before, think about what Dante's exile had historically entailed and how much his exile had prompted much of his production, the same comedy, for example. So these events heavily inform, without any doubt, these people's works. Guicciardini returned to his Florence only after the siege of the Imperials ended in 1530. At that point, being reintegrated in the government, because at that point, basically, new government were restored, serving as noted among the Otto, the Pratica. This was a Florentine council managing foreign affairs. His political philosophy, more than in the celebrated history of Italy, was illuminated in a very old work that is literally from the 19th century, was illuminated 80 years ago at this point, in the 10 volumes of unpublished works of Guicciardini, edited by Canestrini, that was a famous Italian scholar, encompassing complete works, in fact, of the thinker, extensive correspondence, reports, memoirs, and fragments that capture the development of Guicciardini's thought. Among these is the dialogue on the government of Florence. This was written between 1524-27. So you understand, before the crack, right, where he championed a mixed kind of government, which he deemed optimal, outwardly popular, but effectively led by the optimatus. This is naturally typically Florentine in concept. This is essentially what the Medici had been doing up to that point. And again, the Medici had already been overthrown. So here the matter is more like conservatively looking at how the system had been run, say at the time of Cosimo il Vecchio or Lorenzo the Magnificent. This model naturally is adjusted to the events, as much as it would be later, as Guicciardini would advocate the necessity of the same system to be enacted again in 1532, and trying even to push this on Cosimo de' Medici, as you know, the same aforementioned son of Giovanni delle Bandiere, and the guy who would instead oust the same Guicciardini from government for good, right? So Guicciardini had again come back to the government after all these troubles because of his enormous prestige and civil service to defend the Medici at that point, and rewarded, so to say, by Cosimo the Younger, the Grand Duke of Tuscany, in this way. Cosimo I, in this sense, is Grand Duke of Tuscany. Things had really indefinitely changed. Guicciardini mostly envisaged a Republican model. Cosimo was to establish something way more autocratic, and as he was placed in that role to begin with, to stabilize Tuscany within essentially now an Habsburgic, say, hegemony. Remember that here the Germans had fought in Italy and things had not really gone too well for them, right? It's mostly the Spanish Habsburgs that are able to coordinate with imperials and to reinforce this system. As the French fundamentally also lost the Italian wars, that will shift towards the battlefields of the Low Countries instead. I made a video about the Italian native French infantry of the Italian wars, which was not that relevant, admittedly, because, in fact, I distinguish from the Swiss in French service that were mostly what the French had as infantrymen for different reasons that we explained in that video and that you already know if you follow me regularly. So obviously Guicciardini was hoping to balance civic participation with elite control of some sort, a system of which he would have been favored also as such a revered figure. A system, as we explained, inspired by classical republican ideals that yet tailored to Florence's factional realities. It must be acknowledged that these Florentine politicians, historically antagonistic toward Venice, beginning with Villani back in the day, and fierce commercial rivals, always had the Venetian system in view, envying its durability. All right, Venice's stable governance. We also made a video about her constitution, especially the further lock that follows to the mid-14th century crisis. Had been built on a unified aristocracy and balanced councils, contrasting with Florence's factional strife. In fact, as we explained, the Florentines had developed in their, say, historical guild government, and so this ostentation of republican participation, a fear for the taking over of a specific lord, but being very open, very broadly open to financial liberty of the various banking houses of Florence, had not really experimented, for example, the Venetian political and strategical needs of controlling a dominion overseas, being routinely engaged in warfare as an obvious occurrence. Not even the Venetians like to spend more than much. We've seen it in the video about the Third Venetian-Genoese War, for example. But they were much more into it from a much longer time. Florence had never really been a militaristic system. They had reached the peak of that fundamentally by the end of the 13th century, where they had been even more performing than Milan to a degree. But eventually, they had asserted some control over other Tuscan communes gradually, so they didn't need too much, even though they regularly underwent some crisis, some, also because of this, some military defeats. They had to soften up, right? They had not geared up for a more prolonged military effort of territorial subjugation. Through their financial power, they could simply absorb all these other Tuscan communes without even having to literally take them over with force. And that's also the reason why Tuscany had remained. First of all, it was not just entirely in the hands of Florence. We've seen it also in the videos about Lucca, at least the one I made, explaining how still in the 18th century, Lucca was a principality of the Holy Roman Empire, sending troops and commanders, at the Battle of Verdun at the beginning of the 18th century under Prince Eugene. So things that mattered as far as also the autonomies of these other Tuscan communes that partially shared that Florentine Republican view, that, however, was too lax, right? Lacked a sense of more proper political and territorial compaction and control. Like, for example, the Milanese, simply because they had much more powerful elites, and the Popolo had never taken over the control of Milan, that had remained sort of lordly controlled for an important amount and somehow more balanced. So Florence, at this point, had been paying for such, to some degree, such incoherence, and paradoxically would be the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, but after having paid for the quite concrete ways of this, also subordination to other powers for such shortcoming, would ultimately work better as a princely state of some sort, right? Look at how, for example, Machiavelli considered power in many ways in ruthless fashion, right? Guicciardini was trying to fit a changing reality by proposing, if anything, more nostalgic models rather than some more principled, theoretical, even sometimes not really applicable system like Machiavelli's envisaged, but still, lacking that resolve, that sort of colder analytical approach that Machiavelli really had. Hence, all the psychological side of Guicciardini's work, right? Even sharp, seasoned figures like him believed naturally that a carefully crafted blend of major and minor councils and tightly controlled nominal leaders could replicate the balanced system of checks Venice had developed over centuries through adaptation and refinement. Being wrong about that, and so mostly using that as a term of comparison with the current state of Florence, and still basically complaining against the new Medicean regimental form. Venice could rely on the solid unity of the aristocratic class in contrast to the bitter rivalries among Florence's prominent families. Also, the Medici had, as we've seen, not just been overthrown because of broader international reasons, but had suffered plots, right? Think about the Pazzi one that had killed Lorenzo's brother back in the day. So we're really talking about that level of liberty that allows also for this lesser checks that now are greatly, at least reduced. Bringing to some kind of more of greater stability for the system, but still in this background of general subservience to other powers and also restriction, in fact, of political rights, basically within the Florentine establishment at the hands of the same Medici government. Among the unpublished works is a collection of 403 so-called political and civil reflections written in 1529-30, where Guicciardini gathered observations of various kinds. Penned in 1529-30, so also in pretty terrible times as well, these reflections are imbued with deep bitterness and mistrust of humanity, at times seeming to reflect a cynical and self-interested soul, right? Something that basically withdrew from the evil of the world. This was really Guicciardini's character more than else. There's the sense, I want to stay out of this. It's like, it is a traditional concept as well. It's mostly some other authors throughout history pass through the same ideas by saying, okay, we have mostly to work on the ruins of what was and surviving in some way. Guicciardini was even more introverted in this and at the same time sensitive about the picture. This provided the basis for an essay. It was published as far as 1870, but that is important to remember because of the aforementioned context of the Italian Risorgimento, and so what kind of opinions existed at that point in history, in particular in Italy, regarding what had occurred to the country 300 years before. So basically deny at least a uniform pacing in the process of Italian unification under whichever governmental forms compared to other countries that had already underwent that. This is very important because we're talking, the same year what this essay was written was the one of the Franco-Prussian War as well. This was importantly for Germany, same case. When you look at France, that was a country very early unitary profile, just like England, for example, while Spain, being the biggest power around, was technically not quite unified in the way we intend. It was still a sum of crowns, right, from an institutional point of view. And that's also fascinating because it tells you how institutions as a whole are not merely the measure of some kind of general development. You can have different forms producing different results, and the substance also differing in that. We'll talk, if anything, more about Spanish history soon from the same era. In any case, this essay was written by Francesco de Sanctis. It was titled, I think in Italian, something like The Man of Guicciardini, which refers to the Renaissance man, the ideal man, right? So what kind of man, as a citizen, as a as a governor, as a politician, right, as a Florentine, as an Italian in that context, would have had to be like. And always consider what we said before, that the Italians at that point mostly intended themselves as Italians in what was the straightforward national Latin national terminology of the year. Was used also because Latin was basically the official language of all countries out there, in recognizing, like, I don't know, in Germany, the existence of a Germanic nation, of the Holy Roman Empire, right? But in Germany, like in Italy, and these countries are quite important, tied up by not just the Holy Roman Imperial connection, but the actual political fragmentation. In fact, that they were unified 10 years distance only in the 19th century, exactly in this context, and that's why it's so historical. It's therefore in ways that we must understand naturally here, mostly, however, from a Florentine filter, because the greatest allegiance was not to a theoretical Italy lacking, a unified state, but obviously to the polity of reference, which is also what you should use analytically, methodologically, to understand what was actually happening during the Italian wars. Because again, there was no such thing like a unitary state that was aggressed and or merely, an entire geographical dimension was taken out. Okay, we'll take everything over in this country and we'll succeed to do so. Nobody really thought that this was a thing. Even without Italy, it doesn't matter how well geographically outlined the peninsula is, nobody thought, say, okay, now we will besiege Venice and we'll take everything over, Rome, Florence, Milan, Naples, whatever. Of course, attentively, everybody would have liked that. It's not like French ambition was not as high as kite, so to say. But and also, in fact, these different countries had sort of different attitudes. Like the French straightforwardly thought that Italy was just some sort of extension of France. Francis I was obsessed with the classics, with Italian humanism. He almost had the crown bankrupt to have a splendid library with all uniformed, lilied, covered manuscripts, etc. And everybody was crazy for Italy, literally, because of the aforementioned, again, top cultural level that the peninsula had in Europe, but by far at that point. But, I don't know, for example, the Spanish felt much more, limited in that, right? They knew that they couldn't quite simply step, for example, in Holy Roman Imperial land out of a general Habsburgic alignment. For example, Milan, that was part of the Italic kingdom, was yes occupied by the Spanish, but it was still an imperial fief, right? And not in a Spanish sense. The Spanish garrisoned it, controlled it, but in theory, this was in the hands of the Habsburgs. That they had neither even sort of fully established a capital firmly in Vienna. That's mostly something that occurs from the 17th century onward, even though, of course, Vienna was the most important center de facto. But Lombardy would historically remain, also up to the 19th century, the most advanced land in the Habsburgic Empire. So more than Austria, obviously enough. So you understand how sort of peculiar this thing really is. Normally, a country that is more advanced civilizationally conquers another, and by fundamentally enriching it in other ways, right? Spain didn't have the level of civilizational advancement of Italy. Didn't have the popular. Didn't have the general capacity even to presume that it could control even in the previous generations, for example, the Neapolitan hinterland, without negotiating with the local barons to basically have that subcontracted to them. This was an old thing. We've seen it also in the videos I made on the medieval Sicily, medieval Naples, etc. Central and northern Italy was more efficient. The reason why Milan was basically the only country was left void, if you think about it, because it wasn't really substituted by a Lombard power of some sort. Here you see, for example, the Grand Duchy of Tuscany was, I was saying, an independent country. Independent, actually, say, was a subject of the emperor, etc., but de facto remained also as a thing on its own. The papacy, Venice, Savoy, Genoa, etc., regardless of regime changes, protections, etc., Milan was literally occupied, right? There wasn't like something like a Milanese government. I mean, there was, in de facto, of course, in the way any community was ruled at the time with its own councils, etc., but there wasn't really a Milanese dynasty that was working for somebody else or some. So paradoxically, that's the product of a more advanced administration the Milanese had created also to facilitate the moment in which they were taking over somebody else's government. So it's really like a very complex story, telling the truth. And De Sanctis' essay that we were mentioning before is probably not correct in many ways, because for this guy, we'll skip his background, but say the political and moral outlook drawn from Guicciardini's reflections would essentially mirror that of the entire Italian nation. So basically this melancholic, moody, withdrawn, sort of heartbroken, disappointed, pessimistic individual would have incarnated the broader spirit of Italy in this Risorgimento interpretation of the same work. Right? It's as if you have, again, in that literary sequence that we're talking about at the beginning, Machiavelli that still sort of got it, that talked about the art of war, the fact that Italians were strong in a military sense, and eventually Guicciardini that had witnessed the war's disasters, saying, okay, well, no, everything's over, is doomed. Think sort of more about yourself, or I don't know, reflect on how wicked men, generally speaking, are. This is obviously not what most Italians would have necessarily felt like. I mean, surely these feelings were shared by many inhabitants of the peninsula, but they weren't expressed in the same way. I mean, it's difficult to again see Venice thinking that, given her protagonism, or I don't know, some Abruzzese farmer out there that was already under somebody else, some foreign dynasty, even though in his own Italian land, since the times of the Normans. And so things are a bit more shaded in all of these powers: the papacy, Genoa, Savoy, and as you see, all the various small. There are basically like a few tenths of Italian states. Most of which are actually minor. The bigger ones are what we listed. But it is, in fact, if you think about it, we will talk about this because, as you know, I'm starting a modern history manualistic series, so to say. This was a fairly compact scenario. Of course, not as compact as you could say, again, France or Spain in comparison. But considering, Germany, it was like, subdivided in 300, not even states. It were states to some degree, but they were also mostly like a feudal seigneuries. They weren't actually advanced and fairly centralized Italian provincial, sort of neatly shaped territorial polities. Everything is something, from a side, probably worse than we have realized, especially when you get what kind of potential Italy had and lost in the process. But also not as much better. It was actually better in as much as, in fact, these powers mostly negotiated some kind of, say, general influence and control. In some cases it was soft power, in some cases it was more direct occupation, but overall, right? Especially in the center and the north, with the notable exception of Milan, there wasn't really a loss of independence of these countries, or loss of de facto independence. If it wasn't for the fact that other countries, however, also in the outcome of Italian wars, had stepped up in terms of more cohesive regional, national power and strategic projection. I mean, Spain here was dominating, right? From this time onwards, we're basically looking at so-called Spanish Italy. That, again, is something a bit more complicated than Spanish Italy when, again, things changed at the beginning of the 18th century. Because this was also a fairly prosperous time. It's not like the Italians had it badly under the Spanish, as it was, for example, believed by the Italians in a nationalistic sense in the 19th century. It turns out that Italy was fairly rich, right? Of course, being mostly under somebody else's hegemony was definitely not a good thing in a political or civic sense. But when, from the War of Spanish Succession onwards, the Habsburgs took over Lombardy, for example, the once hegemonic Spanish fashion, just we're talking about apparently minority things, was immediately substituted by the French one. Obviously not by the Austrian, but because the Austrians couldn't compete in that broader international cultural influence. But for saying how also superficial, in a matter of really a few time, even this foreign presences could evaporate. So again, very different from a simply conquered country that is remolded or colonized or whatever. That's not what happened in early modern Italy. And so the aforementioned De Sanctis essay was presenting naturally the paradox of why Italy in the 16th century, so advanced in culture and intellectual achievement, was morally depleted and unable to defend herself. And that's the big question. Why did that happen, right? Today we're not going to properly answer that. Obviously, there had been a crisis. There's been much saying about this, also from a military point of view. The notion was that the condottieri were just some sort of romantic relic of the medieval past that weren't updated. This is absolutely not true. This has been very well ascertained historiographically speaking. The Venetian condotta was by far one of the most advanced armies in Europe at the time. The Milanese were really impressive as well. This is not really, but Naples, even the papacy actually had the best condottieri of all. Had they been a bit less feudal, a bit more unified, they would have actually taken over the peninsula, which is the hugely underrated aspect in terms of papal history. As we'll see now, problems were really different. They literally were a matter of concentrated force and mass, even of less qualitatively performing countries that, however, had actually more stato, as the Italians said. That was something that bitterly, as ironically Machiavelli was criticizing the French not having, because they had at some point made some choices that he didn't like, but actually the French were, in a statal sense, the most advanced countries out there, the most advanced country out there, at least if we intend by statal that kind of cohesively political and territorial compactional control that the crown of the Valois had managed to establish by that point, and it is really fascinating to see, in fact, how you get this Italian balance that was very difficult even to keep within the same Italy, because there were some countries like, some polities at least like Venice and Milan that were tendentially hegemonic, right? I made a couple of videos about, the condottieri era that is Caravaggio and Molinella, and those are very interesting because they are fought after the, or say at least in the moment in which the Italians were trying to establish a specific balance with just every state having a sphere of influence. You realize that was the moment in which the Venetians were on the rise in continental Italy, and they were a step away, literally a battle away from hegemonizing the entire central northern Italy. And God knows how things would have gone. The Milanese had had almost succeeded in doing so in the second half of the 14th century. So imagine coming from that background, having a power that can compete with one another, maintaining this balance, and basically not having the possibility as city-based powers who had tendentially pursued some more also contained territorial extension because of the general affluence of their citizenry that admittedly wanted to pay, if anything, somebody else to go at war, and in this sense not developing a more articulated citizenry-based military system, nor having the vast cohesive national resources of France. Or in terms of, at least of actual, we're talking millions of inhabitants, even Switzerland at the time, right? If you wonder how the Swiss did that, if you look at Milan or Venice, yes, these were very advanced places. Nothing to do with Switzerland at the time. It was basically a wasteland. But since exactly many people were involved in the arts, in crafts, in industry, they didn't want to be militia, even sort of part-time one, at least in part they would be, but they would try to delegate most of the broader military effort to some costly professional military that, however, was just ad hoc used and mostly designed to counterbalance these other Italian states' injuries. And again, this was not actually developing a bad military system. Again, if the Italians had fully united against foreign invasion, no country in Europe had the capacity to conquer Italy, to invade Italy even. There was no way whatsoever. It's simply the same Italian behavior that brought to this, okay, if, I don't know, I weaken Milan as Venice, I gain something, and after all, it's not like France or Spain can wage war forever. There are different campaigns, different alliances, which is essentially actually what you see throughout all the Italian wars that are in part triggered, in fact, not just by some external aggression, but this constant rivalries between the Italians themselves, right? So, the negative sort of interpretation of Guicciardini's work, stemming from some kind of guy that wants to stay aside from trouble, basically, was emphasized by the scientists who said that Italy would have been akin to the so-called wise man that Guicciardini describes, as opposed to the mad one. Who seeks only to bend all things, human and divine, temporal and spiritual, to his own advantage. In other words, like, if something comes to me, in this sense, it does reflect at least the typical behavior of the single Italian state. Saying, okay, if for the moment I can see my enemy shattered and I can earn something out of that, I may make it out of it. This is not how things went. Especially Venice found out the hard way, and we'll talk about these battles of the Italian wars. It's, by the way, unjust to infer from a few aphorisms which depict the baseness of most people that this was, of course, the true essence of their author in this case, particularly since Guicciardini proved capable of striving for an ideal as well, namely keeping the foreigners out of Italy. So something that definitely conflicted with the more, in fact, defiled attitude of the Italian states at that point. If they could stay out of the mess, like they would always be involved in some way, but again, mostly at diverting these forces against one another. This was really typical. Also, during the age of the free companies, there naturally was a very different situation, with these free companies being essentially just war bands, not foreign powers of any sort capable of making any permanent change in the political picture, or any for that matter. It's not like they settle, etc. But you realize that if they existed, if they were out there, and they succeeded in scoring a significant result against the, at least in raiding, at some point crossing the Italian city-states, countryside, etc., it was because there were actual leagues, as if central northern Italy was split in two factions that threw to each other these free companies. It's the same thing that, I don't know, the Carolingians did between West and East Francia with the Vikings, right? And so at that point you realize that these systems were actually more advanced in that case than any of these outsiders, right? During the Italian wars, it's slightly different. Admittedly, again, foreign powers do not have the capacity to subdue Italy as a whole. Large chunks are left out, fundamentally, not unscathed, actually reducing their autonomy, but still fundamentally as free countries. within the traditional feudal order of the Holy Roman Empire. And again, you know that the Austrian Habsburgs didn't have this capacity of controlling Italy at that point. You had to wait for the 18th century to have a proper foothold there. They were actually, as we've seen also in the videos about the 16th century Habsburgs in southeastern Germany, pursuing a very similar policy to the one of the Italians in terms of general balance, except fortunately for them, the surroundings, the outskirts of Habsburgic power were very much fragmented, as we've seen before, very much sort of even primitive, compared to what was happening in Western and Southwestern Europe. With Italy, it was different with now a united Spain, a united France. Those were the main contenders. And the general, again, balance that could derive from that. So at large, we see even still, for example, a sort of Italian pride in front of these events that Guicciardini expressed or Machiavelli had, in realizing that even though they were being beaten and that they weren't really contributing in a decisive manner to the wars that were fought in their own country, they were still involved. They had the power. They were the ones sort of enacting this for however their own lack of vision, lack of will, properly to favor in any way any possible neighbor, if this could eventually be a direct threat to themselves. And given, again, the Italian balance, this is kind of obvious, because if you had, I don't know, a tendentially hegemonic country in Italy, maybe you would have had this or that power trying to break out free of that, but at least you would have had some general trend already set, like, I don't know, this region is being hegemonized towards a tendentially nationally unified direction. At this point, there wasn't anything like that. So if you move one piece of this balance, you immediately create a void that others want to fill, and that still does not alter the fact that by each other's standards, these Italian states could take each other's over, and paradoxically still thought of themselves to be enough, in fact, resilient to keep largely like foreign presence out in direct control of the peninsula, as in sort of 50-50 actually happened. And that's the underrated aspect of the war. Guicciardini, well, in serving the Pope and the Grand Duke, even though he was disappointed by the latter, and at some point, as we've seen also by the different governments that succeeded, especially in Florence, because his insight and experience convinced him that opposing a force would lead to greater destruction. He rightly recognized that the Medici Principate protected Tuscany from foreign oppression, which is, as we were just saying, what actually happened. The Tuscans kept being governed by Tuscans. A pragmatic stance that prioritized regional stability over, for example, futile resistance to inevitable power shifts. And so even though he was actually kicked out by, say, the greater rings of power by the same Grand Duchy, he understood in the end that that was a way to also, let's say, in the scale of states, to minding your own business, being content of your position, just like Guicciardini at the end of the day was, fortunately, because of his social and cultural background. In fact, the greatest mistake of De Sanctis' work stands in casting Italy's collapse as moral failing as a whole. Like, Girolamo Savonarola might have done this with greater legitimacy at least. Savonarola, as you know, was a Dominican friar preaching moral reform in Florence during the 90s of the 15th century, briefly leading a republican government before his own execution in 1498. And if morality were the true case, it's unclear why the unscrupulous, for example, Ferdinand the Catholic, whose ethics were worse than those of Machiavelli's prince or Guicciardini's wise men, prevailed. As we were just pointing out before, Italy would always remain a more advanced country than Spain, even if Spain had a global empire, had a stronger army, and at large, again, was the greatest power in Europe at the time. Still, did not have the Italian standards of living. This is very interesting to observe, right? This is something that you can look at today's Europe as well, that even when people look at, competitivity, right, and the kind of how much do salaries fit the level of wealth, etc. Well, there is always the sense that, you can bet more on how much a country's salaries can keep coming without realizing, for example, how much money people have in bank, in their pockets. There is not a single parameter to establish the success of a nation, right? And even if, like in this case, Italy had the worst of it, still, it's not like it was obliterated or erased from the political, strategic, or historical scene at all, right? And yet, that's unfortunately the most historiographically underestimated aspect of the war. Italy's downfall was a political military issue. Probably was also a moral one in the measure in which, again, the broader culture failed to realize the necessity of that unity, right? Her forces depleted each other in abetted foreign intervention, while France and Spain's political cohesion channeled all efforts towards a single aim. That is really crucial in many ways. As we were saying before, even the Swiss, basically, as you know, we went very close historically in Europe to have the Swiss actually controlling Lombardy, and after with Marignano, this may seem, bad considering the Swiss bath of blood and that battle, but if the Swiss had sort of historically governed Lombardy, it wouldn't be the hyper-rich country that they are today. Doesn't matter how isolated in that sense for centuries, in a broader sense, still in a secondary role international scene. But history would have taken a completely different course for that country, and God knows how things would have actually gone. Because the Swiss did take Milan at some point during the Italian wars. The French did. That was also yet another option. And so, as you know, things were at some point sort of going back and forth. I mean, the Battle of Pavia and the French debacle in that sense was actually the consequence of a powerful French coming back in counterattack after the imperial invasion of Provence that had been successfully repelled up to, in fact, to a few tens of kilometers to Milan, from Milan. The French had been stopped at some point by the Este. Properly, Louis XII had to withdraw in front of Isabella of Este, controlling that effort in alliance naturally with Aragon. And as you know, the Italian wars are pretty brutal. The Battle of Ravenna, Marignano, Agnello, these are very bloody pages of history. Things dragged on. There's Bicocca. There is, again, we will see them because they are, as you know, the Italian wars are just like an expedition after the other to Italy. That's how it worked. And that's why they weren't technically also a war of conquest, strictly meant, except for Milan. It was sort of more accessible, at least for the reasons that we explained. So it's only Milan. Well, yeah, that was the more important state, the more state of the Italian state, right? But at the end of the day, it was also relatively parceled out, and again, northern Italy was largely in Italian hands. And again, by the way, there is also this aspect to consider: a general pro-Habsburgic alignment at the end of the day, given that the Spanish were mostly interested in some broader control, especially of the routes to Flanders and their southern Italian kingdoms, and the Habsburgs of Austria were basically incapable of making properly a war of conquest at that point. And the general balance with Italian states held, and France was engulfed eventually with her own issues in Flanders and against the same imperials, the same Spanish mostly, and eventually they had the issues of the confessional wars, etc. The general balance remained for a couple of generations, even more, pretty, concentrated. I mean, then there is the 30 Years' War, and then there is the plague. In all this, Italy remains relatively sheltered up to that point, up to the plague that wiped out most of the, or at least the advancement in demographic and especially demographic, but in part also economical growth that had occurred under a so-called Spanish regimen that, again, was also partly there. In Italy, only the state with robust political unity that blocked foreign infiltration, namely Venice, endured, however, because if we look by size, by scale, as we said, Venice was truly the only superpower, mostly at sea, however, that could really have something to say also in the general settlement that the Italian states had taken. They had also been paralyzed on land, given that from this point onwards, Venice would essentially stop any kind of land venture in Italy, as opposed to before, whereas we've seen before they were tended to be hegemonic in the same peninsula. So that's a brutal stopping of any kind of other ambition. You understand there that any kind of bulk of power that could, at this point, dislodge the foreign presence in order to acquire some broader direction of the Italian sort of local the effort, like political built up in a national function was not there. It was properly frozen, dispersed, and if anything, Italian culture remained. The great, again, Italy of the Renaissance, of the advancement in every kind of field that spread, the trace italienne all over the continent, that built other people's capitals, that set the standards of art, of engineering, of law, of philosophy, and more, right? It's all things that you can't even stop listing in practice. It's also false, still speaking of the previous essay, that Italy fell because there were too few madmen and too many wise men, as Guicciardini sort of split the population. It's not guaranteed that noble individuals fighting for their ideals always advance the national cause, as their local loyalties sometimes conflict with it. And this was really typical of the Italian wars. We've seen it, again, with even heads of state, of single mercenaries. It was just, again, a concentration of power, mass concentrated against smaller, fairly tiny and well-organized states that, however, do not have that scale of strategic projection or any broader inclination or preparation for any scenario of that kind, other than possibly a unitary sort of, say, link, like in military coordination, each under their respective banner, right? Pisa's 15-year fight against Florence for autonomy from 1494 to 1509, for example, given that the city had been taken over by Florence in 1406, I described this in the videos about medieval Pisa, created an entry point for foreign meddling. That's how it happened, at least for Tuscany, right? It had been the same peasants who had asked for the French to essentially break them off from the Florentine yoke. And as you understand here, for some kind of hope of autonomization or sort of coming back, maybe also through foreign arms. That's how, for example, how much the Italians thought of themselves regarding any sort of the potential, and sort of which were the lands that mattered. Like the foreigners weren't properly understood as a conquest force. They could be an invasion force. Italy had all a history of foreign intervention. It had never been something off the table. It was actually all pretty normal if you look at medieval history. But in central and northern Italy, it had never brought to some kind of permanent stay, right? And mostly the biggest disaster was the one of Milan, as we explained. But these other Tuscans, for example, thought, are the French going to settle here? Are the Spanish going to settle here? Not quite, right? The Spanish controlled some places like the Presidi, as they were called in southern Tuscany. They were admittedly important, strategically speaking, for, naval strategy and so on, but at large, as we were explaining before, Genoa maintained her fleet. Venice maintained her fleet. Even the Tuscans had their own fleet. We've seen it in the video about the First Mauryan War. They were even pretty good. There were the Knights of Malta that were, say, more international than anything. But let's say the picture was not... also, nobody really cared about destroying Italy, for example. Everybody relied on Italy as a sort of launching pad, in theory, even for a possible crusade. That's how Charles VIII had somehow ideally justified the need to retake control of Naples from the Angevins. Savonarola's Florence was the sole weak point in unified Italian front against Charles VIII to return in 1495. So that, in theory, what happened at Fort Novo, which is a proof that Italians could take the field and de facto, beat the French, even though it wasn't much of an annihilation, and due to reasons that, if anything, we have to study by looking at that battle. But if you look, again, at other famous, also minor sceneries like the Este, again, the Gonzaga, etc., you'll realize that there was quality, there was power, there was a capacity to make things work. The Italians, after all, had an old history of military alliances, strategic coordinations. Think about the Lombard League. But the Condottieri's wars had always been about that as well. So again, one of my greatest desires is to get more in depth to this, in this, especially the military aspects of the sort of the second half of the 15th and the first half of the 16th century. Really look at how and why this military system performed the way it did, considering that it was actually advanced for broader European standards. So again, it's one of those big topics, in my opinion. No scholar has actually come close to fully actually understand in its complexity. All right. In any case, dedication to an ideal is always admirable, but it alone is insufficient to serve a grander and loftier purpose, as factionalism and localism consistently undermined, in that case, broader Italian unity, rendering even heroic efforts politically ineffective. But still today, right, how much do we have to basically acknowledge that the West, for example, is much more powerful? This is not the case of the comparison with Italy, but that we're much more powerful than any of us thinking about local BS actually has the courage to admit, even, because that entails being proactive and actually working out well. So actually, yes, there is a broader crisis at all levels. You can even argue that to an extent this period, also the Reformation, etc., is definitely the consequence of a broader moral crisis generalized in the era, in the times. There is also the Counter-Reformation that surely helps preserving a system that, however, in part prevented its further development, competitiveness, at least in later times for other reasons. So, again, Italian history is always very complicated. Very few people, in my opinion, actually even get it right in the first place. And instead, I think it's, in this sense, an evergreen to test so much of political, historical, and cultural notions, and that's the reason why I make videos like this. I'm glad to make videos like this, and I am especially eager to expand this further so that we can complete a broader picture of historical inquiry and assessment regarding many more sort of regions and times, etc. I must say on Schwerpunkt that the general pictures of people's cultural interest is incredibly disappointing. I think most people do not understand history. The more I make videos on YouTube and the more I realize that there is much greater attention from less important topics, right? And much smaller attention than for topics that are really worth being really properly known. People are essentially just, they assume at least that what they are not familiar with is just their own the subjective an objective measure. In other words, subjectivity dictating moral standards. History doesn't work like that. If you don't know these pages of history, you're cut off from kind of any understanding of the present. Even today, even after 500 years later. And again, it's very, very unlikely to get anything right historically if you're not willing to accept that there are no shortcuts and there is no stopping point, especially in historical research. This is, I think, very important in general. Nevertheless, for today, I stop it here. I don't know when we're going to talk. Well, yeah, we'll probably finish the original series about Florence for the Middle Ages. I don't know how often we'll talk about Tuscany. Again, especially the Medici. I'm glad that we finally gapped a little bit the divide with other topics, because for the Medici we had really done too few. And Tuscany really has many videos now in the playlist. Can't really see it, but let's say it's just the beginning of this, and I don't know how everything is going to eventually intertwine. We're just overall going to hopefully be a bit more, well, Tuscany yet 28. It's mostly just, this doesn't include the modern period as well. So again, yeah, there's a pretty sizable amount of content, but it's just the beginning and there is so much still to do. Very well, for today, however, again, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.